Welcome to part 2 of my story. To give you a quick recap, this is my grandpa, who was from Łęki Dolne. My son, dad, and I traveled from Vancouver Island in Canada to Łęki Dolne to explore our roots. There we found 5 headstones of various Golembas, but we don't know if these people are related to us or not. This is why we've come to Pilsno. This beautiful little town holds the records for Łęki Dolne, Łęki Dolne, and area. Before walking in, I felt this could really be a turning point, so I shot a little video. For some reason my microphone wasn't working well, so I'll just do a little voiceover here. Pretend it's a foreign film dubbed into English. Here I am in Pilsno. Pilsno is a records office for Łęki Dolne, Łęki Dolne, and area. Where the story goes really depends on what happens behind those doors. This could really go either way. I've written out my 2 questions so I don't have to fumble around with my iTranslate app. Wish me luck. When I walked through the doors, there was simply a hallway with a couple of doors and a staircase. I must have looked lost, so a woman approached me. I used my standard line, "Czy mówić po angielsku?" To which she replied, "Nie." I pulled up my questions, which she read, but after realizing she wouldn't be able to help me anyway, directed me upstairs. Out of the 30 or so words she used, I understood secretarish. What I found the secretary is essentially a repeat of the first conversation. "Czy mówić po angielsku?" Except this time, the secretary held up her finger and left the room. Then a tall gentleman who was smiling profusely eked out the word, "moment." Then appeared Lucy. Lucy works for the city but spent 6 months living in the US about 10 years ago, so her English was great. She led me to another office with 2 women at desks with a closet full of registry books. We wanted to find records of my grandpa's family as well as find out whether there were any remaining Golembas. And then this is what we found. My great-grandparents' marriage record from 1907. Agnes Golemba's birth record. According to the immigration records, she never came with the other 8 kids and her parents. She would have been 19 at the time. In 2016, if a 19-year-old was told the family was going to move to Ituna, Saskatchewan, she could Google it and then say, "Hell no." I wonder how Agnes was able to figure that out back then without Google. She must have come over later, of course, because she settled in Hamilton, Ontario. Marja, we knew as Auntie Mary, who eventually ended up in Regina. Josephus we know as Joseph, settled in Hamilton. Franciszak is my grandpa Frank. Amazing, he was born almost 100 years ago, and here I am looking at his birth record. Following this, they said I'd have to check the records in Łęki Dolne. If they don't have what I need, then I'd be looking at Tarnów. Lucy called up the priest in Łęki Dolne. He doesn't speak English, so he was only willing to meet with us if Lucy came along. I couldn't believe Lucy's generosity in agreeing to do this for us, especially since we're complete strangers to her. Here's the priest. When I saw him open up that cabinet, it's like everything went still. You ever had moments in your life where you just stop and try to take everything in? That's exactly what happened to me at that moment. I felt like suddenly I was in this low-budget Polish version of Who Do You Think You Are? Okay, back to being serious. Here's the index for Jan and Katarnia and their 9 children. Again, all but Agnes traveled to Canada. This next index has 2 very interesting stories. This was my great-great-grandparents, Valentinus and Katarnia. First interesting story is that their son Franciszak died at only a year old. They had another Franciszak 11 years later, and he only made it to age 2. I could imagine what it must have been like to lose 1 child, never mind 2. Also, it would not be common to name a child the same as a deceased child in 2016. The second interesting story is that Valentinus and Katarnia They both died on the same day in 1918.
No i teraz nie mieszkają, bo to
Ale na Łękach
na
mieszkała.
Łękach Dolnej.
It says that
No, tu jeszcze mam 1800.
they live in Łęki Dolne.
Here we found the record for Josephus, or Joseph. And here's the record for Stanislaus. So that's 2 gravestones accounted for. And here's the priest investigating the date of the death for Valentinus and Catarnia. And it turns out the index was correct. They both did die on the same day in 1918. In fact, the priest said we should be able to find them in the graveyard since the funeral was performed there. So we had a second look without success. What we found is that there are several graves with crosses and no tombstones. Perhaps they were too poor to afford those, and their death was untimely, so it's not like they had been saving for it. In 2016, your mind would automatically go to a car accident. In 1918, however, they likely wouldn't have had a car. Again, thinking about 1918, we're just wondering if it's got something to do with the war. So here's another mystery. Here's the priest and Lucy posing with my dad and I. To summarize what I found, I made this tree. Valentinus and Catarnia had 5 children. Johann is my great-grandfather. Both Francis X died as young children, and Joseph and Stanislaw lived out their days in Łęki Dolne. Lucy said if we wanted to trace back further, we'd have to travel to Ryglica, which is the city that holds the records for Lubcha, similar to Pilsno holding the records for Łęki Dolne. Lucy had one more lead for us, a fellow with our last name who lived in Łęki Dolne, and she said she could come with us. And here he is. This is Franciszak Golęba. Turns out, he's a bit of a genealogy bug as well. Number 1 and number 2 are his grandparents, Maria and Joseph. I remember them from the graveyard. This is Joseph. He served in World War I. More on this later. I put together this expanded tree to combine what I learned from Stan at the graveyard and Lucy. Stanislaw and Jofia had one son, Eugenus. Eugenus married Josefa. As far as I know, they had no kids. Joseph was married to a lady whom I don't have a name for. They had 2 boys, Tadeusz and Myron. I found Joseph had emigrated to the US via Ellis Island. On a trip back to Poland, he was drafted to the Austrian-Hungarian army, as this part of Poland was the area of Galicia under control of that empire. Talk about bad timing. Myron and Teresa had 3 girls and 1 boy. The boy is named Tadeusz, and he had 3 boys, Andre, Peter, and Lukasz. I found out all of this from Monica Golemba, who I met on Facebook. Monica and Andre live in Biowa, which is by Pilsno. Going back to Joseph, he was remarried to Maria. They had a son, Kazimierz, and Kazimierz had 2 kids. One we met, Stan. The other, Maria, is a physician in the US. Maria is married to another physician, Derek Lazarchuk, and they have 2 children. Alexis, who's going to Vanderbilt University, and Patrick, who's going to Lansing University in Michigan. Stan and his wife lived in the US for 17 years, where Stan worked as a truck driver, but after retiring, they moved to Łęki Dolne. Their daughters, Carolina and Kate, both still live in suburban Chicago, whereas their brother, Macia, actually lives in Krakow. More on this later. The only story I couldn't find evidence for was an additional brother to Johann, Stanislaw, and Joseph. Stan told us there was a story that there was one more brother who immigrated to Argentina. This would make sense as I've seen a lot of Golembas on Facebook from Argentina, but there was no other brother listed on the index, unless perhaps he had moved away before Valentinus moved the family from Lubcha to Łęki Dolne. One other mystery. Stan offered to show us Stan's and Joseph's properties out in the country. These again were his grandfather's brothers. This was Stan's house. And this was Joseph's property. And this was Stan's dad's place, Casimira. We drove to Roglice, but we're out of luck. They advised us to travel back to Lubcha and speak to the priest, but we were getting pretty tired. Without a translator, we thought we'd just leave it for now. Perhaps maybe this is something that Monica and Andrea can explore further. Hint, hint. This is my newfound third cousin, Kate. She contacted me on Facebook the day after I got back from Łęki Dolne. And this is her sister, Carolina. I heard from her on Thursday. Turns out both sisters live about 15 minutes away from the Chicago suburb I've been visiting annually for the last 5 years. We're hoping to meet up this November. This is Kate and Carolina's brother Maciej, along with his lovely wife Anya. Maciej immigrated to the US at age 10. He completed primary, secondary, and post-secondary education there. He met Anya, who's always lived in Poland, at a wedding. 4 years later, they met again at another wedding. And then 6 months after that, they were engaged to be married themselves. Maciej moved back to Poland to marry Anya, and he's been living there for almost 4 years. Now, the beer that we ordered at the restaurant in Krakow is so big, we had about 3 hours to get to know each other. And I had to reflect. On Tuesday, if we saw each other in the street, we would have been complete strangers. However, now, we're family. Back in Pilsno, Lucy asked me if this is my passion. Reading between the lines, I think what she was asking me is what would possess someone to travel across the world to discover their roots? My answer is twofold. One, when people are given a terminal diagnosis, they're filled with regret of the things they know they'll never get to do. I thought, why not do those things now, while my dad and I still are young and healthy? Secondly, it's about this guy. It's been 21 years since he's been gone. I think this trip was a way for me to reconnect with him. I miss you, Grandpa.